All right, let's get right into it. We're about to look at one of the most recognizable images in the world, but probably not in the way you're used to. See, this isn't a religious studies class. We're here to decode a map, a very precise blueprint for a deep psychological journey.
When you look at this through an alchemical lens, it stops being a story about martyrdom and becomes something else entirely. It's a technical manual for the voluntary death of the ego. You know, that little voice in our heads that thinks it's running the show. It's a step-by-step guide for an inner rewiring that leads to a kind of rebirth.
This quote, "This is the key to the whole thing." It's the central metaphor for everything we're about to unpack. For something new and expansive to grow, something old and small has to be allowed to just fall away. This isn't about destruction, not really. It's about making room for what's trying to emerge.
So, let's be super clear about our approach here. We're not here to glorify suffering. We are here to decode a psychological blueprint.
The goal is to understand a mechanism, a repeatable, internal process for taking apart all the layers of identity we've spent our lives building. It's about moving from a state of constant personal effort to what the source material calls impersonal presence. So the real takeaway here is to focus on the how of this process, not just the story.
So, where does this whole drama actually unfold? Well, it's not on some dusty hill 2,000 years ago. It's happening right here, right now, inside each of us.
The name of the location kind of gives the game away, doesn't it? Golgotha, the place of the skull. It's literally telling you where the work is done. This isn't about history, it's about psychology. The entire operation happens within your own consciousness, a fundamental recalibration inside your own head.
And what's really cool is how the cross itself becomes this perfect diagram of our inner conflict. The vertical beam, well, that's our spiritual aspiration, our desire to reach for something more. And the horizontal beam, that's our attachment to the everyday world, our jobs, our worries, our desires. To be fixed on that cross means to willingly hold that tension right in the center without running away until the ego that's caught in the middle just gives up.
Now, in this internal drama, the characters are all different parts of ourselves. First up, you've got Simon of Cyrene. When our ego, the main character, inevitably buckles under the weight of it all, another part of us has to step up. Simon represents our listening faculty. It's that quiet, receptive part of you that can just endure a difficult moment without fighting it, especially when your own willpower is totally shot.
Okay, so at the absolute peak of this internal pressure, a critical choice appears. You could almost call it a chemical choice, a decision about how you're going to process the pain of this whole transformation.
This slide lays out the two options perfectly. On one hand, you're offered gall, basically a narcotic. This is every impulse we have to numb ourselves, mindless scrolling, binge-watching, you name it. The map is very clear. You have to refuse this. On the other hand, you've got vinegar, a purifying acid. This is the willing acceptance of the sharp, bitter reality of this exact moment. And this you must accept.
And here's why. You accept the vinegar because it is the very thing that's going to dissolve the hard outer shell of the ego. Remember that grain of wheat we started with? You simply cannot numb your way to transformation. You have to let the bitterness do its purifying work.
And this brings us right to the climax of the whole operation. It's framed not as a failure, but as a transaction, a total and complete exchange. The price for this transformation, 30 pieces of silver. It's a number we all know, it's pretty infamous. But in this alchemical context, what does it really symbolize?
So, in this tradition, our constructed self is seen as having three bodies: the mental, the emotional, and the physical. Each one is said to have 10 spheres of operation, so 10 plus 10 plus 10. That's 30. The 30 pieces of silver isn't just a bribe. It represents the total sum value of your entire constructed personality. The deal is, you have to sell all of it to buy your freedom. You can't hold anything back.
Even the final moments are coded. The 9th hour, for instance, corresponds to a sphere in Kabbalah that governs our subconscious, our autopilot mode. So the death at the 9th hour means pulling the plug on that automatic pilot. And the two thieves crucified on either side? They represent the two ways our mind steals our presence. The thief of the past is regret. The thief of the future is anxiety. To finish the work, you have to stay right in the middle, in the now, and let both of them go.
Now, for anybody who's actually trying to do this kind of deep inner work, the source material gives a really crucial warning. This is a very hazardous part of the path.
And it all comes down to this one question you have to constantly ask yourself. As you learn these incredible ideas, are you using them to genuinely take apart your ego, or are you just using them as fancy new decorations for it?
There's a fantastic metaphor for this called the ramp. As the ego starts to loosen its grip, you might see synchronicities everywhere, repeating numbers, weird coincidences. These are the ramp, just a temporary tool to help you get to a higher level. The huge danger is falling in love with the ramp itself, becoming obsessed with the signs, instead of actually walking up it and then, crucially, leaving it behind. And these are the big red flags. The ego, in a last-ditch effort to survive, will hijack the whole process. It'll start whispering these thoughts in your ear. If you hear these voices getting louder, you've stopped dismantling the ego and you've started building it a brand new spiritual throne. It's a very subtle but critical mistake.
So to pull this all together, it's so important to see that while we've been using one very specific set of symbols, the underlying process, well, it's universal. You see this exact same process in other traditions. Think about the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree. He's assaulted by the armies of Mara, which are just the two thieves in the offer of gall in a different costume. But he doesn't move. He stays present. The demand is exactly the same, a total stop to the ego's endless project of trying to become something better, something different.
And that leaves us with one final thought, a question to really take with you. Looking at your own life, your own identity, your attachments, what's the grain of wheat in you that has to be allowed to die so that something much, much bigger can finally have the space to grow?
All right, let's talk about something that sounds, well, pretty intense, right? The death of the self. It sounds like something to be afraid of, but what if it's not an ending at all? In this explainer, we're going to frame it as a deep psychological process, not about being annihilated, but about a kind of structural subtraction that actually reveals what's been underneath all along.
And this quote right here, it just hits the nail on the head. It gets at the core paradox we're digging into. The idea that all that effort, all that desperate clinging to save our fixed idea of who we are, well, that's exactly how we lose touch with reality. It suggests that the real path to finding something true involves letting go.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to take apart this whole idea of I. Then we'll see how it starts to come undone. After that, we'll talk about what it actually feels like to be in that in-between space. And finally, we'll expose the biggest, most subtle trap in this whole process. Okay, Section 1, an unstable identity. We're kicking things off by questioning the one thing we usually take for granted, that our sense of self is a solid, real, permanent thing. So let's really pull back the curtain and see what this I is actually made of. This right here is the central idea. The self isn't a thing, it's a process. It's a habit. You know, think of a whirlpool in a river. You can see it, you can point at it, you can even give it a name, but it's not a solid object. It's just water moving in a particular habitual pattern. And our sense of self? It's kind of the same thing, just a pattern of thoughts, feelings, and sensations that we've gotten really, really used to calling me. So if the self is a whirlpool, what's the water? What are the building blocks? In Buddhist thought, they're called the khandhas, or the aggregates. You can think of them as the raw materials, your body, your feelings, your perceptions, all of it. And the force of identification is like the glue that sticks all these disparate parts together to create this convincing, but ultimately temporary, story of me. And that's why the so-called death of the self isn't some big, dramatic explosion. It's much more like the slow, steady erosion of a cliff face by the ocean. The glue that holds all those aggregates together just starts to lose its stickiness. The result isn't some instant flash of enlightenment, but a really profound sense of disorientation, like the very ground you're standing on is shifting. Okay, so if the self is just a habit, how do you break it? That brings us to our second section, the Great Unraveling, where we're going to look at the actual mechanism that kicks this whole process off. It all starts with what's called a visceral insight into these three fundamental truths. Now, this isn't about just nodding along and saying, yeah, okay, things change. No. This is a deep, gut-level knowing. It's the kind of realization that hits you on a physical level, that there is absolutely no solid ground, no lasting satisfaction to be found out there, and ultimately no permanent self to protect. It's a total game changer. Once you have that deep insight, it leads to the core mechanism, a withdrawal of consent. It's like your mind takes a good long look at all the machinery of its own personality, the constant chase for status, the ambition, the carefully manicured self-image, and it just stops. It refuses to play the game anymore. It's a sharp, powerful refusal to keep pouring fuel into the ego's engine. You're not fighting it, you're just cutting off its supply. So, the old self is dissolving. Great, but what does that actually feel like when you're just trying to get through your day? That brings us to our third section, navigating the void. This is all about the real lived experience of being in this strange, in-between place. Now, it's really easy to look at this state and mistake it for clinical depression, but it's crucial to see the difference. Depression often feels heavy, emotional, and full of a sense of despair. This ontological negation, as it's called, is very different. It's characterized by a feeling of lightness, of spaciousness, and a very distinct neutrality. It's not sadness. It's more like the absence of the usual story you tell yourself. It's a quiet state of simply waiting. And this table really breaks down how that plays out. On the surface, you might experience things like indecision or feeling emotionally flat, or even like a ghost just observing life. But look at the column on the right. That shows you the structural reality behind those feelings. The indecision is there because the ego's grip on your will is loosening. The flatness happens because you've stopped projecting your hopes and fears onto everything. These aren't personal failures. They are the predictable, mechanical signs that the old operating system is being uninstalled. And you know, this whole thing isn't just in your head. It often shows up physically. Deep, profound fatigue and even issues with your immune system are pretty common as your whole system recalibrates. The key here is not to romanticize it. This isn't some spiritual badge of honor. It's a real physiological event that needs to be treated with care and, yeah, actual medical prudence. Get some rest.
All right, let's get to our final section, and honestly, this might be the most important one. You've navigated the unraveling, you're sitting in that void, and right here, right at the very edge of real transformation, is where the most subtle and dangerous trap of all is waiting for you. So let's make this really personal for a second. I want you to think about a time you felt empty, or lost, or just totally uncertain. What was your immediate impulse? Was it to just sit with that feeling, or was it to scramble to find something, anything, to fill that empty space? A new project, a new identity, a new spiritual belief? That impulse. That's the setup for the trap. And here it is. This is the trap. It's called positive ontology. The ego, which is absolutely terrified of the vacuum of not knowing, pulls off this brilliant survival move. It takes the emptiness itself and turns it into a new, even better identity. It stops saying, I am a successful person, and starts saying things like, I am the witness, or I am universal consciousness. It turns the absence of a self into a new, shiny, positive thing to be, and in doing so, it stops the whole purification process right in its tracks. So the instruction for navigating this stage is incredibly precise. The work is purely subtractive. That's it. You have to resist every single impulse to define what's left over. The practice isn't to figure out what you are, it's to simply, clearly, and repeatedly see what you are not. Not your thoughts, not your feelings, not your body, not even the spacious emptiness. You just keep negating without ever adding. So after all that subtraction, after the obstruction is finally fully removed, what's left? You don't get some new, improved, shiny, enlightened self. That was the ego's fantasy all along. What remains is simply what was already there, buried under all the noise. Just presence. An uncluttered, responsive, and totally clear awareness. It's just reality, finally perceiving itself without the filter of an I getting in the way. And that brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with. Let's call it a practical experiment, a challenge, an ontology fast. For just 24 hours, could you completely resist the urge to define yourself? Could you just let that fundamental question, who am I, hang in the air, totally and completely unanswered? Because the ability to rest in that not knowing, that is the very essence of this entire journey. So, many of us are chasing that big aha moment, that profound insight that's supposed to change everything. But what happens the morning after? How do you actually live when that lightning bolt fades and you're just, left with your life? Today, we're going to dive into this ancient piece of wisdom and see what it means to chop wood and carry water after you've woken up. And this idea, it goes way, way back. This is a quote from Layman Pang, who was an 8th century Zen master. Think about that for a second. What's his definition of a miracle? It's not levitating, it's not some crazy supernatural event. He's saying that real power, real magic, is found right here, in the most ordinary tasks you can imagine. Drawing water, carrying firewood. It's a complete flip of where we're told to look for the profound. And that brings us right to the heart of the matter. So you've done the work. You've read the books, you've meditated, and maybe you've even had that earth-shattering moment where your sense of self just, poof, dissolved. That's amazing. But now, the bills are still due, the laundry is piling up, the world didn't stop spinning. So what do you do now? Right. So let's get into that first moment right after the breakthrough, because honestly, it's often not at all what people expect. This is what we're calling the shock of the ordinary. This slide just nails the jarring gap between what we think is going to happen and what actually does. On the left, you've got the fantasy, right? We expect to be walking around in this state of permanent radiance, totally exempt from all the boring stuff. But the reality, on the right, well, it's a little different. You still have to do the laundry, you still have to pay the bills, and instead of constant ecstasy, you might be hit with something called a dreadful sobriety. So what on earth is this dreadful sobriety? Now, it's really important to get this. This isn't depression. It's not apathy. It's clarity. It's seeing the world with startling, unvarnished clarity, without the filters of your old hopes and fears and stories. It's just existence, as it is. All the social games and ambitions that used to seem so important, they just lose their color. And here's what that internal shift really looks like. Those old hooks, the need for approval, the drive to climb some social ladder, they just lose their grip. But this doesn't leave you empty. Instead, a kind of inner stability, something really solid, starts to form. And the paradox here is that as you become more solid on the inside, your behavior on the outside becomes more flexible, more adaptable, because you're not defending a fragile ego anymore. Okay, so if all your old motivations have faded and you're in this brand new kind of volatile state, how do you ground yourself? That brings us to our next section, the wisdom of routine and how you can find an anchor in this new world. And here we are, right back to our central theme. Look, this isn't just some poetic phrase. It's a direct, practical instruction. In that really vulnerable time after the death of the self, routine is your medicine. It's the prescription for stabilizing this new, wide-open awareness. So how does this actually work? Well, think of these simple physical tasks. Doing the dishes, folding clothes, just doing your job. Think of them as a kind of container. The old structure of your ego is gone, right? So this new consciousness needs a vessel to hold it, to keep it from just dissipating. And routine provides that absolutely essential structure. But chopping wood isn't the only anchor. Re-engaging with your community is vital. See, interacting with people, it forces you to translate your inner state into something functional. It provides this healthy friction that stops you from developing a spiritual ego, which is a very real trap. And then there's service, helping others. It becomes a natural outlet. When you're no longer obsessed with yourself, that energy has to go somewhere, and it just starts to flow outward. Okay, so you're doing the work, you're grounding yourself in routine, but you might get really frustrated when old habits, anger, anxiety, whatever it is, keep popping up. Why don't they just vanish? Let's talk about the mountain of habit. The concept here is karmic inertia, or to put it in more modern terms, think of it like psychological momentum. Your personality is like this massive flywheel that's been spinning for decades, carving these deep grooves in your brain. Even after you cut the power, which is that moment of insight, that wheel is going to keep spinning from sheer momentum. Those are your old habits, your conditioned reflexes. They don't just stop on a dime. I absolutely love this quote because it's so direct and honest. Just because you see that the mountain of your personality is an illusion, that doesn't mean it instantly disappears. It still has weight. It still has momentum. The work now isn't to magically make it vanish, but to patiently, day by day, wear it down. So, what's the game changer here? It's your relationship to those old impulses. Before, when irritation came up, you'd say, I am irritated. Now, you see it as an impersonal, mechanical event. You just observe. Irritation is arising. You decouple your identity from the feeling, and that is the whole game. And here's a really practical model for how that works over time. It's a loop. First, an old habit gets triggered. Second, your awareness just recognizes it without any judgment. There's that defensiveness again. Third, you decouple. You refuse to pour the fuel of I and me onto that fire.
And fourth, because it has no fuel, the energy of that habit just fizzles out. You do this 1,000 times, 10,000 times, and slowly but surely you wear down the mountain. So as you practice this, a really advanced skill starts to emerge. It's the ability to live in two worlds at once. Let's explore what that actually means in this next section, navigating two realities. This slide breaks it down so perfectly. On the one hand, you've got apparent reality. That's the world of jobs, taxes, social roles, names, and forms. It's the costume we all have to wear to function in society. But on the other hand, there's this underlying reality, the direct, raw experience of life as just an impersonal, ever-changing flow. The big mistake we all make is confusing the costume for the person underneath. So the goal here is mastery. It's not about rejecting the world and refusing to pay rent because, money's an illusion. No, it's about playing your role as a parent, an employee, a friend, with total precision and care, while never forgetting that it is, in fact, a role. Your inner anchor stays firmly planted in that deeper, flowing reality. So after all this work, after facing that dreadful sobriety, building routines and learning to navigate these two realities, what has actually changed? Let's summarize this really profound, yet incredibly quiet shift. This table is such a great before and after snapshot. Let's just walk through it. Look at motivation. It shifts from this hunger for more stuff and more status to simply doing what's functionally necessary. Routine transforms from a chore into a grounding practice. Your identity goes from being this fixed idea you have to defend to being a flexible tool you use to interact with the world. And finally, conflict is no longer about defending me. It's about calmly observing cause and effect. It is a total overhaul of your operating system, even if, from the outside, you just look like you're calmly doing your job. And this just brings the whole journey full circle, doesn't it? We end up right back where we started, in the ordinary world with ordinary tasks. You are still carrying the water, you are still chopping the wood, but your relationship to it, your inner state while you're doing it, has been transformed from the ground up. And this really says it all, doesn't it? The path isn't about escaping to some other realm or achieving some state up in the sky. The way is right here, in the simple, direct experience of living a human life, but with an open and aware heart. So we'll end with this question for you to take with you. What are the simple, concrete, humble tasks in your own life that can be your anchor? What's the laundry, the commute, the daily email that you can transform from just a burden into a practice? What wood do you need to chop?
All right, let's jump right into this really fascinating term, thaumaturgy. It literally translates to wonder working. But what if the greatest wonders aren't work by adding something to the world, but by taking something away? That's the big question we're going to dig into today.
So you hear a word like thaumaturgy, and your mind probably jumps to images like this, right? Miracles, maybe some kind of supernatural power, a little bit of magic. But the source material we're looking at today suggests that this whole idea, it misses the point completely. It's proposing something way more subtle and, honestly, a lot more profound.
And this quote right here, this really sets the stage for us. It completely flips our normal concept of power right on its head. See, it suggests that real power isn't about being the biggest, loudest, most commanding presence in the room. No, it's about a kind of power that comes from a totally different place. Let's break down what that actually means.
Okay, so first things first. We have to just completely dismantle this myth of theatrical miracles. The wonder-working we're talking about here is not a performance, it's not for an audience.
The source is super clear on this. Yeah, the word literally means wonder-working, but we need to just throw out any ideas we have about casting spells or making these grand magical gestures. This is not about gaining some new power.
And here is the absolute heart of the matter. Thaumaturgy isn't something you do. It's a byproduct. It's what just naturally happens to the world around you when that disruptive force of your own ego, your own self-interest, is totally removed from the equation.
So how does this actually work? Let's get into the nitty-gritty. The source describes it almost like a law of physics, but for consciousness.
Now, look at this contrast. It's so interesting. On one hand, you've got your typical interaction, which is basically a collision, right? My ego versus your ego, we're both defending our little patch of turf. It just creates friction, conflict, but in what the source is calling the thaumaturgic effect, one side just stops defending. It removes itself. So that opposing energy, anger, aggression, whatever it is, it comes forward and it hits nothing. It has nowhere to go, and it just dissipates. The whole pattern of conflict just ceases to exist.
And this breaks down the mechanics into 3 really clear steps. First, because you don't have a personal agenda, you don't provoke other people's egos. Second, your communication becomes crystal clear because there are no hidden motives messing things up. And third, you de-escalate everything. You break that cycle of conflict because when negative energy comes at you, you just don't send it back. The chain is broken right then and there.
This leads us to another really key idea: how you deal with all the negativity in the world. And it's not about absorbing it. It's about stopping it in its tracks.
You know, we've all heard this kind of spiritual idea of absorbing the karma or the sins of other people, like you're some kind of metaphysical sponge. The source here argues that this is a total misunderstanding. It's not some mystical transfer of a burden.
The actual mechanism is something far more precise, almost mechanical. It's called non-propagation. So you receive the impulse, someone's anger, let's say. But because that internal machinery of reaction and retaliation has been dismantled, you simply don't pass it on. You don't return it. You don't amplify it. It just stops with you.
I absolutely love this analogy from the source. It is so simple and just so powerful. Imagine that wave of anger, of negativity, of conflict. It rolls in and it just stops. It meets a shore that doesn't create a returning wave. The energy just dissolves right into the sand.
So, all of this builds up to a really profound paradox. The way to have this incredible effect on the world around you is to actively give up the desire to have any effect on it at all.
This table just makes the distinction crystal clear. Let's look at it side by side. Thaumaturgy comes from an absence of self. It's spontaneous. It has no goal. It's just a byproduct. On the other hand, you've got an occult or hypnotic feat. That comes from the exertion of personal will. It's deliberate, it's manipulative, and it is laser-focused on a specific outcome. They are 2 fundamentally completely different things.
And here is the catch. This is the big one. You can't try to do this. The moment you think, okay, now I'm going to perform thaumaturgy, the ego is right back in the driver's seat and poof, the whole capacity just vanishes instantly. That's why it has to be concealed, not for some dramatic secret, but out of pure functional necessity.
So that's why, when things just sort of harmoniously resolve around a person in this state, and someone asks them, "Wow, how did you do that?" this is their honest-to-goodness answer. It just happened. And this isn't them being falsely modest. According to the source, it's a literally accurate description of events. The I, the ego, didn't do a thing.
So here's maybe the most surprising part. What does this actually feel like from the inside? You'd probably expect some kind of ecstasy or a huge surge of power, right? Nope. The source calls it a listless peace. It's the quiet you experience when that noisy, clunky, friction-filled machine of the ego finally stops rattling. It's the silence of a system that's finally running perfectly.
Okay, this all sounds very high-level and abstract, I know. So how can we get a tangible feel for this? Well, the source wraps up with a simple but really profound practice to let us observe this mechanism in our own lives.
Here it is, a little experiment for you. For the next 48 hours, anytime you contribute to something good happening, a success at work or whatever, explicitly deflect the credit. Just say something like, it just worked out. Or, the timing was just lucky. Then, just watch. Observe how frantically your ego scrambles to claim authorship, to get that little pat on the back. The practice isn't really about deflecting the credit. It's about watching that frantic need inside yourself and choosing not to feed it.
And that leaves us with this final question to really chew on. We spend so much of our lives trying to build up our presence, our influence, our personal brand. But what if real, transformative power, what if true wonder-working isn't found in what we project out into the world, but in the resonant silence we create when we finally get out of our own way?
All right, welcome! Today, we're diving into a really profound shift in consciousness. The source material for this explainer calls it the appointed. Now, right off the bat, I want to be clear, this is not some glorious title or rank. It's more like a diagnostic label for a deep, structural change in how a person actually experiences reality.
To get us started, let's look at this piece of ancient wisdom. This isn't just a pretty sentence, it's a signpost. It's pointing toward a very specific state of being, a kind of solitude that has nothing to do with being lonely. It's about a deep, internal self-reliance, a kind of homecoming.
The source describes arriving at this stage as a really distinct feeling. It's like a hush that settles in beneath all the usual mental chatter. It's the sense that the world, with all its drama and its demands, has, well, it's lost some of its gravitational pull on you. Suddenly you realize you're standing somewhere new.
So what is this new place? Well, it's what's known as a liminal space. And to really get a feel for it, the source borrows a term from old-school alchemy, Albedo. It was a stage of purification, of whitening. What it means for us is that you're not fully in your old world anymore, but you're not completely free of it either. You are literally in between.
So what do we call someone at this stage? As we said, the source uses the term the appointed. But, and this is so important, it's not a badge of honor. It's a functional diagnostic label. Seriously, think of it like a GPS coordinate on a map that just says, you are here. All it means is that a fundamental shift has happened, and you've entered a path that now has a kind of inevitable forward momentum.
And you know, this isn't some brand new invented idea. It actually maps almost perfectly onto a well-known concept in Buddhism, the anagami, which literally means the non-returner. This is someone who has reached a point where they won't be reborn into the world of sensory experience. It's a big deal.
Okay, so how does someone even get here? Well, the main achievement of this stage is breaking the first 5 fetters, or chains, that tie us so tightly to the sensory world. So let's take a look at what's been loosened up.
And this number is really key, 5. It's not arbitrary. It signifies that a huge, measurable transformation has already happened. We're talking about 5 specific, heavy-duty bonds that used to run your life, and now they're either gone or seriously weakened.
So what's really cool here is just how practical these changes are. First, identity view gets shaky. You start to see that you are more of a verb than a noun. Second, that nagging doubt about the path, it's gone. You just trust the process. Third, clinging to rites and rituals for security fades away. You only do what actually works. And these next 2 are huge. Sensory desire is way down. You can still enjoy a good meal, but you're not a slave to it. And finally, ill will is broken. Sure, you might get annoyed, but that deep, simmering hatred, it just can't find a place to live anymore.
But here's the twist. Just as you break these old chains, a brand new challenge pops up. And this one is sneaky. It's the hidden trap of the spiritual ego.
I mean, this is the ego's survival instinct kicking into overdrive. The second it hears a fancy label like the appointed or anagami, it tries to snatch it and wear it like a shiny new crown. It starts whispering in your ear, hey, I did it. I'm special. I'm more enlightened than those other people.
And this slide just nails the core danger here. You have to understand the difference between a designation and an identity. A designation is just a map coordinate. I am here. That's it. An identity is a story the ego tells itself. I am special. The moment you turn this stage into an identity, you've fallen right back into the very first chain you worked so hard to break.
The source actually gives this tendency a name. It calls it the skanda demon. It's that little voice, that personification of the ego, trying to co-opt all your hard work. And the advice for dealing with it is just brilliant. When you hear that voice whispering about how special you are, just laugh at it. Seriously, you dismantle its power by refusing to take it seriously.
So managing your inner world is one thing, but what about the outside world? Interacting with people, well, it gets different. The things that drive society often just don't make sense anymore, and that creates its own set of very real challenges. And here are 3 major social pitfalls to watch out for. First, the trap of giving advice. When your perspective has shifted this much, your well-meaning guidance can actually feel like an attack to someone else. Second, the trap of alienation. It's so easy to look at the world and feel separate or superior, but that's just an ego defense, not wisdom. And finally, the trap of praise. This one is the sneakiest. Flattery can actually be more dangerous than criticism, because it's like pouring cement on that new spiritual ego you're trying to dissolve. Okay, so navigating this new social landscape is pretty tricky. It really raises the question, what's the skillful way to respond when these things happen? How do you actually handle it? Well, this table gives us an amazing playbook. For every hazard, you've got the ego's totally predictable reaction, and then you have what's called the alchemist's response, a much more skillful way to turn lead into gold, so to speak. So when someone praises you, the ego puffs up. The alchemist's move? Ground yourself. Remember, this is just a temporary state. When you're criticized, the ego gets defensive. The skillful response is neutrality, realizing they're probably just reacting to their own stuff. And when you see confusion out there, the ego wants to be the savior and fix everyone. The wiser path? Compassionate non-interference. To help with all of this, the source offers a super simple, super powerful tool, the anti-speculation protocol. It's a 3-step process. Step 1, you just notice your mind wondering about your status. Am I there yet?
Step 2, you meet that thought with a simple, firm, and honest answer. I do not know. And step 3, you immediately bring your attention right back to this moment, right back to reality, like the feeling of your own breath.
So it feels like we've climbed pretty high, right? The air is clear, the view is amazing, and a lot of the noise of the world is far below. But it is absolutely crucial to understand that this high plateau, it isn't the final summit. The journey is far from over.
And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? Rest here for a moment, stabilize your footing, but do not build a house. This is a place to catch your breath, to get your bearings after a really long climb, but it is not a destination. To get attached to this state, to build a house here would be the ultimate trap. So, the work is not finished. After this whole stage of purification, the path keeps going. But what comes next demands something so much bigger than just breaking chains. It demands total surrender, a complete transmutation of the self. So what could that possibly feel like? Well, that's the question to carry with you from here.
All right, let's get right into it. We talk a lot about the hard part of transformation, right? The struggle, the breakthroughs, all that intense work. But what happens after? You know, in that quiet space when the fight is over, but you're not quite at the finish line yet? That's the fascinating territory we're going to explore today. See, after the toughest parts of the journey, you step into this really curious, almost peaceful period. You're still living your life, but your whole relationship to it has changed. You become what this material calls a tourist, a kind of detached, sometimes even amused visitor in a land that used to be your home.
So here's our game plan. We'll start with this idea of the unexpected rest stop. Then we'll get into what it really means to be a tourist. After that, we'll look at a hidden danger of this phase, connect it all to some ancient maps of the soul, and finally land on the huge cognitive shift that this is all leading up to.
Okay, so first stop. This phase, it's not the final destination. Think of it more like a necessary and, honestly, a much-needed break. It's a reprieve after all that intense inner work. It's like you've been climbing a mountain and you've reached a high-altitude base camp where you can finally catch your breath.
So what does it actually feel like to be a tourist in your own day-to-day life? How does this whole rest stop idea play out in the real world that you used to call home? Well, here's the core of it. The tourist stage is when you're still doing all the normal stuff, working, talking, living, but you're no longer desperately trying to squeeze meaning or safety or status out of everything around you. That constant nagging urgency, it's just gone.
And this line just nails the feeling, doesn't it? It's like you're living in a country, but you don't have a passport anymore. You can participate, you can be polite, but you're not bound by the old local customs of anxiety and striving that used to run your life.
This smoke without fire idea is brilliant. It gets at the mechanics of what's happening. Those old habits, getting irritated, feeling anxious, they might still flicker to life, but there's no fuel to keep them burning. A tiny pause opens up between the trigger and your reaction. Your awareness catches the anger before it can really ignite, and the energy just fizzles out. You're not suppressing it, you just see it's pointless. This chart really shows you the nuts and bolts of the shift. Let's look at that first row, motivation. It goes from being driven by this feeling of, I need something to be okay, to a much simpler question, what's needed right now? And then check out emotions. They go from being these sticky, tar-like things that can ruin your whole day to just being fluid, like clouds passing through the sky that don't leave a trace. But, and this is a big but, we've come to a really critical point. This newfound peace feels so incredibly good, especially compared to the struggle before, that it's incredibly tempting to just stop here, to think you've arrived.
And that leads to the biggest, most important question of this whole stage. Is this it? Is this amazing feeling of relief the enlightenment you've been working for? And the answer, believe it or not, is a very subtle but very definite no.
And here's the key distinction. Relief is simply the absence of pain. It's that feeling when the struggle is over. It's the summer home. But liberation, that's the presence of something new, of a deeper truth. It's the final destination. Mistaking relief for liberation is like deciding to live in that cozy rest stop cabin when the real view is from the mountain summit, still waiting for you.
So if you can't trust that feeling of blissful peace, what's your compass? Well, the new guide is what's called sober resilience. It's not the dizzying high of a spiritual peak, and it's not the low of despair. It's a quiet, steady, stable presence. You see, both ecstasy and despair are just weather patterns. This resilience is the bedrock underneath it all.
What's so amazing about this is that it's not a new idea. This exact psychological landscape has been mapped out for thousands of years in some of our most important stories, especially in the lives of figures like the Buddha and Christ.
Now, if we look at this from a functional perspective, not a religious one, the parallels are just incredible. Both figures face a final test, Satan's temptations, Mars' assault, which is really about confronting the last-ditch efforts of the ego. Then comes this crucial pivot point, a death or a cessation of the old way of being. And what's the result? A resurrection or an awakening. You come back into the world, but the old illusion of a separate self is just gone.
The key mechanism in that Buddhist map is this really wild idea, Nirodha Samapatti. You can think of it as a complete cognitive reboot. I mean, imagine hitting Control-Alt-Delete on consciousness itself. It's a state where everything just stops for a moment. And when you come back online, your entire operating system has been permanently upgraded. And all of this leads to the ultimate point of the entire journey, a fundamental change in how your consciousness even works. And there's a beautiful, beautiful metaphor for this. It's like trading in your flashlight for the sunrise. Okay, let's break this down. Normal consciousness is like a flashlight in a pitch-black room. It lights up reality in these little, separate snapshots. This thought, that feeling, this sensation. And we're constantly stitching those flashes together to create this feeling of a solid, continuous me. But awakened consciousness is totally different. The flashlight's off, because the sun's up. The mind doesn't need to chop reality into little bits anymore. It can just rest in the vast, continuous flow of what is.
So, where does our tourist fit in? The tourist stage is that incredible transition period. Your flashlight is still on, but the batteries are dying. You're starting to rely less on your own little beam of light, because you can feel the warmth and see the glow of the approaching dawn. So, if any of this sounds familiar, if you feel like you're in this place right now, please know that you're at a highway station. It is not a failure to rest here. In fact, it's absolutely required. You need this time to acclimate to the new altitude before you make that final climb. And to make this really concrete, here's a little 24-hour experiment for you. Call it the visa check. For one day, treat every single situation, a stressful meeting, traffic, a family argument, like you're a tourist on the very last day of your vacation. Engage with everything, be totally present, be polite, but on the inside, just refuse to take ownership of any of it. Just keep that little mantra going in your head. I am just visiting. Which brings us to this perfect final thought. Enjoy the peace. Enjoy the relief. By all means, enjoy the holiday from your old, struggling self. But always remember, you are a tourist. Don't apply for citizenship. The journey isn't quite over yet.